This is Section 9, Lecture 2, and in this lecture we're going to be talking about major economic theories that influence our economic policies here in the United States and influence our economic statecraft and how we use our economy and the underlying theories behind them to try to influence the world and achieve our goals in foreign policy. This will be more of a purely economic lecture, or theoretical lecture, I should say. But I do have some specific examples of these economic theories in practice related to how our foreign policy is exercised. One major theoretical perspective, and perhaps the oldest major theoretical perspective in political economy, is nationalism. And this is also referred to as mercantilism. And so I have it described here. This is the pursuit of political power that determines what we do economically. We are concerned about the power of our nation state relative to others, if you remember the realist perspective. And so then, our commercial activities, what we do in the world, is not based on purely economic gain, but political gain relative to other nation states. And there are three fundamental ideas that underlie this. National power and national wealth are tightly connected. That is, if we are concerned about our national power, our political power in the world, and of course this has been a major theme throughout the class, then we have to be concerned about our economic strength. Our economic strength leads to our political power. A second point. International trade is one way to achieve wealth, to achieve economic strength. And this will differ from the other theories that we're going to discuss, because here mercantilists or economic nationalists argue that the true way to achieve economic strength and political power is through a positive balance of trade. A positive balance of trade is where we are sending more in goods and services out to the rest of the world than we are bringing in. And rather than bringing in other nation states' goods and services or trading for that, we are trading instead for money. And so we are acquiring others' money, others' gold or silver, so on and so forth, in exchange for our domestically produced goods. Well, according to this set of ideas, that's good for business, that's good for our broader economy, but it is also good for our relative power versus other nation states, because it grows our economic strength. Economic nationalists argue some types of economic activity are better than others. I mentioned before that this is the older idea or perspective or theory of political economy and how nation states act. And so then, the economic activity that early economic nationalists focused on was manufacturing. And manufacturing was better than agriculture in order to gain wealth from abroad. So if we think in a historical perspective, all nation states prior to the Industrial Revolution were engaged in agricultural pursuits predominantly. But as nation states began to grow, as the Industrial Revolution began to kick off, investing in manufacturing and selling those goods to other nation states, those goods that they couldn't make for themselves, then was a great source of wealth for industrializing nation states. And so economic nationalists will argue industrialization is a requirement for nation states to gain wealth from others. You trade finished manufactured goods that other nation states can't make for themselves for their money, rather than goods and services that they may provide to you. The theme here is all about political power and how economic strength leads to it. And this is seen in a summarization of this ideology. Contemporary economic nationalists argue that government should play a vital role in how a nation state allocates its resources. They argue that because economic strength leads to political power, our economy is too important to allow for the free market to reign. Governments should manipulate their markets positively for the strength of their national economies. Governments should avoid their country being dependent on other countries for goods and services. And so then, in order to achieve and promote economic self-sufficiency, governments must engage in protectionist policies. We'll discuss what that means later on. But basically, to protect your economy from others' economies, to protect your industrialization, to protect your goods, to protect your workers, to protect your wealth. Governments must be engaged and intervene in their economies. And so I have here, this is how Britain emerged as a first world power during the Industrial Revolution. We could also say that elements of economic nationalism are how China has increased a lot of its wealth in recent decades. We see this theory in practice in U.S. foreign policy. And so I have one example here, that in 2005, the oil company Chevron bid over $16 billion to buy the California-based oil company Unocal. But China's state-owned oil company outbid Chevron to buy Unocal. Well, this is a key good, and we can all fundamentally agree that having access to natural resources, having access to oil, is a key necessity to a modern economy and to the strength of a nation state. So, members of the U.S. Senate, rather than allow the free market to reign, demanded a review of the sale of Unocal to this Chinese national company. Additionally, other members of the Senate threatened to impose a tariff on Chinese imports unless it allowed the value of the currency to rise on market demand. China manipulates its currency in order to keep its currency cheap and thus its manufactured goods cheap. The cheaper they are, the more we will buy from them. Due to these threats, the Chinese national offshore oil company backed away from the deal, and Chevron bought Unocal. So you can see there that our politicians, particularly here in the U.S. Senate, wanted to protect elements of our national economy, wanted to maintain the strength that gave us, and certainly did not want to allow our major economic rival, China, to gain in more strength by buying this U.S.-based oil company. And so there we see economic nationalism in practice. The major set of theories or theoretical perspective on which the United States, our major economists, our politicians focus and say that our economy is based on is capitalism. Well, classical economic liberalism is its more formal academic or theoretical name. And your textbook defines this as a system that protects private property and commercial activity from government interference. And that is because of these underlying or fundamental assumptions of the classical liberal or capitalist perspective. The purpose of economics, they argue, is not to enrich the nation state or lead to the nation state's power. The purpose of economics is to enrich individuals. And so then the focus is on the individual producer, the individual consumer, our businesses, industries, firms, corporations, and their wealth, not necessarily the wealth and power of the nation state. Countries, they argue, can gain from trade, period. Now this is whether or not they run a positive or negative balance of trade. They argue that more trade in general is better than manipulating a trade surplus. If we try to manipulate a trade surplus, that positive balance of trade, then others will attempt to do so as well, and the world will cease to trade with one another as much. But the way that individual producers and firms and businesses and corporations increase their wealth is to do business not only here in the United States, but with the rest of the world. And so the free trade policies of our governments, these agreements and treaties, go along with the ideas of capitalism or classical economic liberalism. One of the criticisms is that this may lead to a negative balance of trade. That is, when a nation state brings in more imports than we send out in exports, the wealth of our nation state is leaving our country. If you remember from that chart from the first lecture of this section, that is where the United States is. We are the #1 importer, but only the #2 exporter. That means we're running this negative balance of trade. However, in this theoretical perspective, it is argued that the consumer is better off in this situation, that we are enriching consumers by allowing other nation states' goods to come in at a cheaper rate than we can make them, and therefore consumers will have more money to spend on other goods and services, perhaps domestically made goods and services, then that will help our domestic producers. And this is based in the idea of specialization, that countries will be made wealthier by producing products at a low cost and selling them abroad at a higher cost, but only those products that they can specialize in, that they're better at making than other nation states. And so if you become the best at making a particular product or set of products, let's say high-tech goods, for example, then other nation states will pursue other types of production, and you can then corner the market, the global market, in that particular good or service. And that's the way to enrich your nation state, by enriching your people through this specialization. And so to sum this set of ideas or theories up, governments should be detached from markets, and markets should be allowed to operate without political interference. This is the idea that we see mostly from the rhetoric of our politicians. The governments should be deregulating rather than increasing regulations on our firms. We should be lowering the taxes on business and industry so that they will make more profit, that they will expand their industries, so on and so forth. That we should allow deregulation of trade as well. That we should trade more with the rest of the world and allow the invisible hand of the market to guide economic exchange. And so politics should stay out of business, according to this perspective. Politics should serve only towards making things more economically efficient. And so then, government should prevent monopolies, guarantee contracts, guarantee security, protect private property, and build infrastructure. After all, businesses and industries benefit from the infrastructure of our interstate highway system, our railroads, our ports, so on and so forth. But other than that, should be limited in their interference with businesses and industries. So government should take a back seat. And this is referred to as laissez-faire, a hands-off approach to economic activity in one's country. An economic doctrine prescribing non-interference by the state in commercial, corporate, and competitive affairs. So then, if we look at the rhetoric from our politicians, we see then classical liberalism plays a large role in how we do things. This is the basis of our free trade system. It is the basis of political arguments for lower corporate taxes. It is the basis for political arguments of less regulation on industries and businesses. Right? This hands-off approach, capitalism, and allowing global trade and free trade to occur is the dominant set of arguments we see from our politicians. Well, we see this play out through any number of instances. This is the basis of the building of the World Trade Organization. The U.S. has a large hand in that. And when we negotiate with other nation states through the World Trade Organization or through regional trade agreements, this set of ideas or ideologies are behind that activity. And we see then different approaches theoretically in how this comes about. A society-centered approach is one where politicians respond to businesses, politicians respond to interest groups and their demands. Of course, in a democracy, we're open to, or our politicians are supposed to be open to this. And then because the demands of businesses and the demands of interest groups are such that want more trade, less regulation, then we see that influential in making our foreign policy, particularly when it comes to our trade policy. But we also see that the comparative advantage is also an aspect of our foreign policy. We want to encourage sometimes particular types of industries, those that we specialize in, those that we're best in. And so we see the promotion of high-tech industries by our government, the promotion of agriculture, so on and so forth. Those in which we have a comparative advantage, those in which we have efficient productivity, we have better technology, so on and so forth, as the basis of our trade strategies as well. We will open up our nation state to trade on those things that we don't necessarily have an advantage in anymore, but protect those that we do. And so here we see then that the United States is in any number of free trade agreements. The free trade agreements that we're in directly are listed below. But as a broader part of our trading policies, our economic statecraft, we are a member and a founding member of the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that then became the WTO. Many of our free trade agreements are nation state to nation state. That's that term I have here in the middle, bilateral agreements. But many are multilateral agreements, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement and others. Bilateral trade agreements are those that we have with nation states below. So we have free trade agreements with Australia, Bahrain, all these nation states listed below. That is because the ideology, the theories behind our current government policies have moved away from economic nationalism over the past many decades to a capitalist mindset, the classical liberal economic theories that encourage our government, encourage our politicians to want greater trade, more trade with other nation states. Finally, another major perspective in international political economy is socialism. And this is based on the ideas of Marxism. And I have Marxism described here. The criticism of Marx is found in trying to understand why in capitalist nation states there is falling profit. And that is, according to Marx, based on competition between industries, and ultimately he bases that competition on industries as the source of economic failure. He argues that individual capitalists seek greater profit and market share, and so they invest their labor rather than in employing people. They invest in labor-saving techniques, mechanization, industrialization, so on and so forth, in order to increase their profit. But this leads to disproportionality. That is, the value of goods and services, the value of the economy and the wealth of the economy is going to be distributed unevenly across a nation-state's society. If people can't afford goods that are made because they are not the ones making them, because there's not enough employment, then supply and demand will change unevenly. If you mechanize an industry and lay off a bunch of employees, then those employees will not be able to buy the goods that are being made, even though the production of that good is more efficient and at a greater number. And so you get this periodic overproduction and underconsumption. Marx also argues that capitalism and the competition of capitalism leads to the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, while the masses have relatively less wealth. And so the ideas of socialism and the perspective of socialism is that the nation state should be involved in its economy in order to redistribute the wealth of its economy. Recognizing then that this isn't going to come naturally, that these disruptions like the falling rate of profit and disproportionality and the uneven concentration of wealth is a product of capitalism. And so what Marx argued initially and what socialists still argue today is for a redistribution of wealth in a nation-state's economy. That is, you have policies that put people to work. You have policies where nation-states own specific industries and control specific industries, particularly big industries like natural resources. You have other socialist programs that allow for the uneven distribution of wealth to be spread out, like different proportions of taxation at different income brackets. You have social safety net programs like child care, old age pensions, what we call Social Security, health care coverage, what we call Medicare and Medicaid, all of these sorts of things that redistribute the wealth of society that help out those people who are at the bottom rungs of a nation state's economy. And so this is what socialist policies do. I have here at the bottom that socialism is a mix of Marxism and the views of classical economic liberalism. And so we see then a country like China having transitioned from Marxism or Maoism to capitalism, still use elements of control, government influence, government regulation, government ownership of industries, in order to manipulate their economy to not just grow, but then also make sure that they can redistribute more evenly the wealth in their society. Of course, socialism does have an influence on our economy as well. We do have those social safety net policies. These aren't necessarily part of our foreign policy, however, so we'll leave them aside here.